The president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, is in Israel this week, where he's made some controversial comments about North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. But speaking to reporters Thursday, the former New York City mayor accused special counsel Robert Mueller of trying to, quote, frame the president.
In order to try to develop evidence against him, they've brought a number of very questionable cases. The prosecution of Mr. Manafort for things in 2005 that had nothing to do with President Trump. I can't imagine whether Mr. Manafort did something wrong or not. I can't judge, but I can say it has nothing to do with President Trump. And then these Russians that were indicted, who are never going to come to the United States, who played dirty tricks like dressing up as clowns. If that's Russian collusion, I don't know, maybe it is. But the real question is, there's not a single link to anybody in America. So what's that about if it isn't trying to formulate a case on the president when there's no evidence for it?
It's been more than a year since the investigation into Russian election meddling was launched. We want to check in with a panel of legal experts as to where it stands now. I'd like to bring in Daniel Goldman in Washington and Miriam Baer in New York. Daniel is a former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. Miriam is also a former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. She is also a professor at Brooklyn Law School. Welcome to you both. As we just heard there, Miriam, let me start with you. The president's lawyer there was downplaying that connection between Paul Manafort and Donald Trump. At the same time, earlier this week, the special counsel accused Manafort of tampering with witnesses. Now, how problematic is that, and could prosecutors use it as an opportunity to flip Manafort?
Okay, well, it's certainly very problematic for Mr. Manafort, right? So when you are released on bail, one of the key conditions is that you not commit a crime, either a state, local, or federal crime. And so now the special counsel has come forward with evidence showing probable cause to believe that Mr. Manafort was tampering, potentially through an intermediary, was attempting to tamper with two witnesses, right? So he's essentially trying to get a message out to them, which is, hey, if you're asked, we weren't doing any lobbying in the United States for the Ukraine. That's clearly a violation of the witness tampering statute. So that puts Mr. Manafort in a lot of trouble, and indeed that's why the judge has ordered a bail hearing for June 15th. So what that means in the short term is potentially Mr. Manafort may lose his home confinement and release and go straight to jail while he's awaiting trial. And in terms of flipping, that's the word everyone likes to use, the view out there that some people have said is, well, this will put so much pressure on Mr. Manafort that he'll sort of say to himself, I'm going to go to jail anyway, I'd better cooperate with the government. One thing to keep in mind, however, is he doesn't get to unilaterally decide that. Cooperation is a two-way street, and the government gets to decide if it actually wants to cooperate with a witness. And it's quite possible that the government has reached the point that it has decided that Mr. Manafort can't really help it, or maybe isn't credible. So we should watch for that. Just because Mr. Manafort might decide he might want to cooperate, that doesn't mean he will cooperate.
Yeah, what about that, Daniel? What do you think? I mean, will we even know whether or not the special counsel in this case thinks that Manafort is even worthy of flipping at this point?
Well, we can't know from the outside, and that determination would likely only be made after a number of meetings between Manafort and the prosecutors. So it would be some time before we would ever be able to determine that. One thing to look at would be what happens with the trial dates for Manafort that are approaching. But the other thing to keep in mind with Manafort is that he's been charged, on the one hand, with some of his conduct that's unrelated to the campaign thus far, even though, contrary to what Rudy Giuliani says, some of that conduct occurred in 2017. It was not all from 2005. But we know that the special counsel's authorized to investigate Manafort for the collusion side of things as well, and there have been no charges against him. So that's an ongoing investigation against Paul Manafort that is hanging over everything related to his case.
Daniel, let me stick with you. Meanwhile, on Wednesday, adult film star Stormy Daniels sued her former lawyer and the president's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen. According to the suit, she says the two men colluded to cover up her alleged sexual encounter with President Trump. Does that open up the possibility of the president being deposed?
Well, possibly, but very far down the line. The real risk that the president runs of being deposed is in a completely separate lawsuit unrelated to Stormy Daniels, but actually relates to one of the Apprentice contestants, Summer Zervos, who has already defeated a motion to dismiss, and they're already entering what's called the discovery phase, which is when depositions occur. So to the extent that the president will ever be deposed, it will likely first happened in that case. What's interesting about this new lawsuit I found were these text messages, which are not only going to be of interest to Stormy Daniels in this lawsuit, but would also be very interesting to prosecutors investigating Michael Cohen for campaign finance violations. Because remember, Keith Davidson also represented Karen McDougal, a playmate who alleged to also have an affair with Donald Trump. And if they were somehow coordinating the two separate agreements, one with the National Enquirer's parent company and one with Michael Cohen, in order to prevent the public from learning about these affairs right before the election, that's very powerful evidence that they were trying to avoid the public learning about it, which could be a campaign finance violation.
Yeah, what's your take on that, Miriam? Those text messages, when it comes to campaign finance violations, potentially, that is pretty significant.
Well, we only have portions of them, so we're going to want to see more. They are interesting because, remember, Mr. Davidson and Mr. Cohen are theoretically supposed to be adversaries, right? The whole point is that Mr. Davidson represents Ms. Daniels or Ms. Clifford. And so what's weird about those text messages is they don't convey an adversarial relationship. Certainly, Mr. Davidson is an interesting figure in all of this. And he may be someone of interest to multiple parties who want to learn more about him and the other people he may have purported to represent.
Let me ask you about the president's tweet, Miriam. Earlier this week, he tweeted that he had the absolute right to pardon himself. And since then, you've had top Republicans like Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan say that he shouldn't do that. So if it came to it, and if he did decide to proceed to pardon himself, what would the implications of that be?
Right. Well, obviously, there's the political implication, and then there's the legal question. And the political implication seems to be that this would cause many people to call for impeachment, whether or not that would actually happen. So it would have very strong political implications. Now, the legal questions that a lot of law professors are right now and legal scholars are debating is, can you do that, right? Does the Constitution actually allow for a president to self-pardon? And there are a number of professors who have begun to argue, no, you can't do that. Number one, it would allow the president to make himself almost a judge in his own case, so there's that kind of concept. But there's an additional argument now that's being asserted by two professors in particular, Ethan Lee and Judge Sugarman, and they're basically saying, look, the Constitution says that the president has to take care to faithfully execute the laws. That's in the Constitution. Well, you're not faithfully executing the laws if you pardon yourself as president to get out from under an investigation. So that's the argument they're making. Obviously, all of this would be hashed out, one would think, in a court, or it would just blow up into an impeachment proceeding.
Daniel, what are your thoughts on this notion of the president pardoning himself?
Well, I think it's so anathema to everything that we believe in our democratic concept here and the construct of our government, that the idea that a president could use this incredible power to absolve people of guilt or grant clemency and just be able to use it for himself in order to clear himself from all criminal exposure, I think there's just something gutturally that everyone understands that can't possibly happen. The problem is there's no clear answer in the Constitution. And even as to this take care clause argument that the president must faithfully execute the laws, there's an obvious and good argument that the pardoning is not a law. It's a constitutional provision. And so it's really unclear from the text of the Constitution itself, and it would, in theory, be a very interesting litigation in court. But I don't think it'll ever get there, and because I don't think the president will do it, because it is political suicide. The more interesting question to me is whether he can pardon his family members or his potential criminal associates, if it ever got to that point, to prevent them or try to prevent them from testifying against him or giving information against him. I think that's a much more realistic possibility, and that also falls into sort of the same self-interested use of what is intended to be pardon power for, the powers of the presidency.
Yeah, those are really interesting questions. Well, separately, the Wall Street Journal reported the administration has put a search for the number 3 Justice Department official on hold. Now, according to the report, potential candidates said they were not interested in the position. Daniel, what does that signify to you?
Well, it signifies to me that anyone with a strong resume wants to stay away from this Department of Justice. And part of that may be, and this is what's so problematic about what's going on in our country right now, part of that may be the attacks that the president and his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, are repeatedly making against the Department of Justice, against the FBI, against the institutions of this country, and that no one wants to put themselves in a situation where they're just going to be constantly ridiculed, constantly attacked for partisan reasons. And really, the Department of Justice has traditionally been an apolitical, nonpartisan organization. When I worked there, I never thought 1 second about anyone's political affiliation, no matter what it was. I didn't make any charging decisions based on anyone's political affiliations. And when you have Rudy Giuliani and you have Donald Trump constantly talking about these 13 angry Democrats with all these conflicts, they're not thinking at all about, whether they made campaign donations in the past. They're looking at the evidence, and it really undermines the credibility of the Department of Justice when you are getting the commander-in-chief and the chief law enforcement officer constantly berating and belittling the Department of Justice. So no one wants to work there.
Miriam, what do you think?
Well, sir, it's an interesting question because this particular position, your day job is actually about antitrust and the civil, overseeing the civil division and the civil rights division. And, the irony here is you're the understudy for this massive investigation should Rod Rosenstein resign or be fired. So that's part of the problem here. It's sort of strange, right? And then on top of that, it means your confirmation process would be incredibly fraught, right? Because understandably, senators would want to spend a lot of time talking about the Russia investigation. So I don't see how any side, I agree. I can't imagine anyone really wants the position right now, but I'm not sure that the White House wants to really even rush to try to fill this position right now. So this is, again, unfortunate because that's an important position, right? We want people to actually want to work in the Department of Justice, and we want our positions to be filled. So that's all part of the unfortunate nature of this blow up.
Yeah, so much in the way of questions about the future of these many institutions in Washington. All right, Daniel Goldman and Miriam Baer, thank you both for your insight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.